Hello, beginning painting students. Today I'm going to show you how to start your first black and white painting project. You're going to be working on a 16 by 20 board. My canvas here is 18 by 24, but I'm going to just create a 16 by 20 area so that I can walk you through the steps of this process. By now you should have already done the warm-up, and we can do the warm-up directly on this board, because as long as when you paint you don't make the paint layers too thick that create a texture. As you can see on mine, you might see some texture on there. For this case I'm not going to worry about it, but in your case, when we did the warm-up, we wanted to make sure that there was no texture, because when it's done we can paint right over it and work with it. Paintings are intended to have multiple layers. You can't just do one layer and expect to have an interesting result or effective technique. And similarly, you can repaint a painting over and over and over again, especially acrylic, because it dries so quickly. So once you finish your warm-up, we're just going to do a gesso wash right over it. If the image you chose is dark, you're going to do a black wash. If it's light, you'll do a white wash like I did on here. It doesn't have to be thick. You don't want to waste paint on this, but it's just to knock out whatever was underneath so you can build upon that. I'll get started. Now, T-squares are very expensive, particularly the ones with inch marks on them. The ones without are more reasonable, but then you still have to use a yardstick or a ruler. And I probably will list T-square on your list if it's reasonable, but since we're only going to use it once or twice, there's some options for doing it differently. But I'm going to demonstrate with the T-square just because it works great, because we can rely on right angles in life as an artist to give us squared off lines. A lot of times people use a yardstick for connecting things, which is really a mistake. Yardsticks are just to get the measurements on those little dots of numbers and ticks. After that, you always want to switch to a T-square, unless you have to make multiple dots, which we may do here if you don't have a T-square. But first I'll demonstrate how to work with a T-square to make a grid. Now, when you're doing a grid, you're dealing with lines. And remember that there are multiple kinds of brushes. You've got brights and flats, and you've got rounds, and you've got all kinds of different shapes. You have angled ones, you have filberts, all these various brushes. But for this one, we're going to pick a round brush, which is the ones that are pointed. Round brushes are only used to make pointy lines, such as this. They come to a point. So I'm going to use a medium brush. People don't think that you want to use bigger brushes than what you need, because they think, oh, I'll use a pointy one to get a fine line. But in the end, it takes forever, and it's a wobbly, uncomfortable line that invariably uses too much paint. So I'm going to use a medium-sized brush, very diluted paint. And just like in drawing, when you do a grid or a gestural mark, you hold the brush loose. Round brushes are designed to be held long. The reason is that you can lean back when you're painting. You never, ever, ever want to use a short-handled brush when you're dealing with acrylic, unless you're doing some tight little design. When you're working and you're standing or working on a canvas or working on a board, this is what you want, long-handled. The other great thing is rarely do you get a long-handled brush that's not designed for oil and acrylic. I like the real bristly brush on the end, real stiff in this case, or a real soft nylon. They should always be springy, but we'll get into that later. Right now, I'm going to divide this 2 by 2 and really, really dilute it. I used a lot of water. So everywhere on here that we go every 2 inches, because we're going to make a grid that's 2 by 2, you just simply put a dot, either with a T-square or a yardstick. And you can see that I have my T-square flush, and gravity is creating a very nice flush position. Now, when you do dots on a grid, you actually have to move your body with every dot. If you just aim for the dot, it gets completely off kilter. You never want to be lazy and sit down and reach across for a dot. You want to really move with the dots on the ruler or T-square, because then they're even. Then you turn it this way. Now, if it doesn't reach, you can grab a T-square that's longer, such as this one. A little harder to do side to side because you have to hold it up. So it's better to just flip it and do it this way. Now, whoops, all right. The only time we don't have this gripped up here is for this. Another thing people do with painting is they don't grip the canvas, so you can't be physical with it enough to have a good result. So we always want to have this gripped normally. There's so many things, every 2 inches here. There's so many things about painting that I want to talk about because it's sort of endless. But the biggest problem is they cut corners, and they're not disciplined. However you are perfectionistic about your palette, your mixing, just like this, moving on the dots, those are what give us good results. A lot of times people kind of wing it. Biggest mistake is they actually use their brush to mix. That's the worst. The brush is a delivery system. The palette reflects the painting, and all of your mixing happens with the palette knife. So once you get this, just like a gesture drawing, very light, long strokes. Fast, long, diluted. You don't want to have this squiggly, hesitant mark. This is why standing is so important, and hitting it right on that dot is important. Another thing that's important is to pull the T-square to create gravity on the bottom. And you want to move a lot, just like in painting. You never want to keep your body in the same spot. Unless, of course, you're working from direct observation. In other words, drawing, just like you would in a drawing. Because that way your eye level moves and your vantage is different. That's different. But for something like this, you want to really move with the picture to get these really clean edges. A little bit uneven down there. I'll recheck that. Anytime it's uneven, you can just add a little more pigment to your line. Not a ton, but just so you know which one's the correct one. What's happening is this is a bent T-square. Once you have all your lines this way, and of course, you don't need to make more than one dot. The beauty of it is you can just do one dot, and then we flip it. I'm going to switch back to the other T-square. If you're lucky, the T-square is 2 inches wide, like this one. So I can go this side, and so on. So I'm going to end up with a really nice even grid. If you have areas like that, the beauty of a big diluted wash is you can just wipe it off or smear it out. Go ahead and wipe that area out just because I don't like that area. It's good enough as long as I can see what I did. And redo that area. That's better. See, that's better. Now I can see what I was doing. There's a dot over there. And if it smears a little, it doesn't matter. The main thing is that it's not leaning. We're going to paint over all this anyway. The only reason we're doing it diluted is because we don't want it to distract too much when we start painting, and also it's a little harder to cover up when it's not diluted. So I will keep going with this. Oh, one more thing. If you find that on one side your square is not as big here, this one, you'll notice that a lot of times canvases are measured including a little bit of the side. So even though it says 16 by 20, a lot of times it's a little bit more. Same with the board that you have. So you can either start in the middle and go out, or start on the side and go across. Either way, you'll have one little grid that's slightly shorter. See how I missed the dot right there? These are common mistakes. It might be a little easier for you since you're working flat, unless you have an easel. I switched the project to accommodate this online format because I don't have access to you in the class like I did. So I have to just adapt my supply list. And I know working flat is not ideal at all for painting, but not everybody has a $100 easel at home. So this is what's going on here. If anything looks a little bit off, you can redo it. Again, you don't want to, well, let's see. Since yours is 16 by 20, it'll make it without the big T-square. And then I'll show you in a minute an option for if you don't have a T-square. The T-square is great because it slides side to side and you only need one dot, and it gives you that guarantee of man-made right angle. So as you go down this, you want to make sure that each square is identical. Except, of course, the one on the end, like I said, is going to be, it'll be more even down there. Depending on which side you start with, there's like 1/8 of an inch difference. If something looks off, double check, redo. Don't let it get too crooked while you go along. And at any time you can go a little bit darker with the paint if you need to make a correction or make it look a little more visible. But it's okay if it's off and then you redo. And I think the reason this happened here is that I was rushing with my dots. So take your time. I just didn't want to make a 20-minute video about this. It looks a little bit better. I'm going to do this like that, but hold it here. I'm getting better, I'm getting better. As long as it's not solid paint, you're in good shape. Also, since acrylic dries so fast, you can always come back with white and clean it up in parts, the squares that look a little crooked. I'm going to finish this on my own time, and then I will put it back up here when it's complete and walk you through the next step, because by now you will have selected your image. And we can transfer that with lines, again with a round brush, to the canvas. So that'll be the next video.